Now as to the present church, her defections and backslidings, of which already they are notorly known, which defections our several testimonies bear witness and testimony against, and these not only of the former times, but also of the latter. And we desire to be sorry and heartily grieved that any professing themselves a minister of the Church of Scotland should own and countenance, concur, and comply with the prelatical Erastianism established in this land, which we of this church were reformed from. Which thing is evident from ministers, their compliance with the acts and mandates of the state, they exercising their Erastian supremacy over this church, as their acts and practice have manifested and declared. Which acts of the state, as it would be tedious, so it would be superfluous to relate all of them. Yet we shall set down so much as we think may suffice to declare the Erastian designs. As that act, anon 1693, entitled, An Act for Settling the Peace and Quiet of the Church, ordains, quote, that no person be admitted to, or continued hereafter to be a minister or preacher within this church, unless that he, having first taken and subscribed the oath of allegiance and assurance, this is the new qualification of ministers imposed by the magistrates, as likewise that he owns and acknowledges Presbyterian church government as settled by the foresaid 5th Act of the 2nd session of this Parliament to be the only government of this church. And how is it settled but on the people's inclinations? And that he will submit thereto and concur therewith, and never endeavor directly nor indirectly the prejudice or subversion thereof. Observe that here the ministers have all, and to seek for more, will make an alteration whatever is wanting, which has been very well observed by a great part of the corrupt ministers, that would not have more than they had the opportunity to have had it. And their majesties, with advice and consent aforesaid, statute and ordain that uniformity of worship and of the administration of all public ordinances within this church. He observed by all the said ministers and preachers as the same are at present performed, and allowed them, or shall be hereafter declared by the authority of the same, and no minister or preacher be admitted or continued for hereafter, unless that he subscribe to observe, and do actually subscribe the foresaid uniformity, unquote. Observe, this church by this act is deprived of that intrinsic power which properly belongs to the Church of Christ, so that hereby they must depend upon the Parliament for what liberty they have, and this is a vitimus for all the rest of their acts relating to the church. But we return. The suffering remnant durst never from a zeal of God's glory love the truth and conscience of their duty, wink at or pass over in silence the national sins of this land, without a testimony against them, but upon every new emergent, as the duty of the day called for a testimony at their hands, so therein they endeavored not to be deficient, and the rather when such iniquitous impositions as hearth money and poll money came to be imposed upon our land, as had never been practicable, we reckoned ourselves obliged to testify against them, and so accordingly we emitted another declaration, November 6, 1695, as may be seen in the following sheets, and albeit there was none of our number that suffered upon the account of publishing of the same, yet we wanted not the bitter reflections of some in saying that it strengthened the malignant party at home and common enemy abroad. In that interval of time, betwixt the emitting of our 2nd and 3rd declaration, as there was nothing in William's time that gave us ground to the emitting of a 3rd declaration, besides what we had already testified against, yet it is observable that there were no amendments to the things testified against either in church or state, for so punctual was he, and pliable were they, that is, the ministers, in observation of that model of church government, which he with his Parliament had first established, that they still persisted and went on without any amendment of the things testified against, for, as was said, the dissolutions, callings, and adjournments of their assemblies was so practicable, that it became a case of confession to these who owned them, and albeit this bad practice had a rank smell of Erastianism, yet how shamefully and basely they subjected themselves to the iniquitous commandments of the state, an instance whereof, once for all, in that assembly, wherein Lothian Kerr was commissioner, who said that he, in his Majesty's name, dissolved this assembly. This was February 13th, 1692. Whereupon the moderator asked his grace if this assembly was dissolved without nominating a diet for another, to which his grace made return in these words, quote, His Majesty will appoint another general assembly, wherewith ye will bitimiously advertised, unquote. Upon this, the moderator desiring of his grace that he might be heard a few words, his grace replied, quote, that as a private person he would hear him, but not as moderator. The moderator answered, quote, Sir, in whatsoever capacity your grace pleaseth, I beg he heard a few words, unquote. His grace replied, quote, that as a private person he might speak. And because what the commissioner had done in dissolving that assembly without nominating another, many of the members were so far dissatisfied therewith that they verbally protested against what the commissioner had done. But as there was much of a coward-like spirit that appeared in their moderator in the resigning up of his post, as above, at the command or word of a man, so how much unfaithfulness in this affair to the concerns of Christ did the commission of the kirk afterward show, while they declined the deed of that protestation verbally given in by some of their number, at the dissolution of that assembly as theirs, which afterwards clearly appeared from their submission to the encroachments made by the magistrate upon the church privileges, as that of their passing from the appointed diet of their meeting, which was to be on the 3rd Wednesday of August, 1693, and their acquiescing to that diet, which by open proclamation was appointed by the magistrate December 6th, 1693, and yet by another proclamation was adjourned to the 24th of March, 1694. Which fearful encroachments by the state has never faithfully been testified against by this church, and though there were no more to declare this church's compliance with the magistrate's Erastian course, their very laying aside these minutes and not bringing them to the world's view, though that they had fitted them for the space of a month in that assembly, as above, where Lothian Kerr dissolved them, we say, if there were no more to testify their dependence on the state, it is sufficient to declare it, and how provoking such a practice may be to the Lord Jesus Christ, the only head of his church, and injurious to the up-and-coming generation, let the world judge. But moreover, the King's Commissioner appointed the first Thursday of April 1695 as the diet of their meeting, yet by the proclamation it was adjourned from that day to the 11th of July thereafter, and from that to the 29th of November, and from that to the 17th of December. And yet, in all this, nothing like zeal and faithfulness in the concerns of our Lord Jesus Christ was seen to appear in such weighty matters. How confounding like may it be to the very Galios of the age we live in, ah, tell it not in Gath, etc. Yea, and so obsequious was this Erastian church to the mandates of the magistrate, as to the holding or not holding of the courts of Christ, that though they were sitting in assembly in the meantime of William's death, and when his commissioner told them that he could attend them no longer, his master being dead, so that albeit they had a fair door set open to have asserted Christ's headship over his church, yet they would not sit, though they might, but dissolved abruptly. Now, after the death of their king, William, Princess Anne, being admitted to the government of the church affairs, she walked in the same footsteps with her predecessor. For the very first assembly was called by her authority, upon which change of persons to the exercise of the government, the suffering party finding themselves obliged by the indispensable oath of God, contained in the covenants, to testify against everything that was destructive thereof. And Princess Anne now being admitted to the government over the 3 kingdoms, we could not but bear testimony against the same upon these considerations mentioned in the Declaration, which was our 3rd Declaration emitted at May 1703. And to conclude, with reference to these declarations following, whatever exceptions they may get from persons of all ranks, parties, or persuasions, yet we persuade ourselves that when the honest and faithful acts of church and state in our best times are judicially approved, that our honest designs and intentions in the publication of these our declarations will also be approved. And albeit we should be counted as fools and branded with various aspersions for the following out of our duty, and adhering to every part of the Reformation of Scotland, both as to church and state, we say our suffering is more honourable than sinning. So those nicknames and aspersions we desire with a Moses to esteem them greater riches than treasures in Egypt. Postscript. As for that pamphlet entitled Church Communion, emitted by Mr. Linning and fathered on by Mr. Shields, we say that our thoughts of it is, though that the once worthy Mr. Shields was turned off his feet by cunning and sleight of Messrs. Linning and Boyd, so that he could not easily recover them again, yet that he was a man more consonant to his principles than so openly to condemn by his pen that which he had so openly avouched before, as may be clearly seen both in the vindication and hind let loose. For we, having had the occasion to know the judgment, humor, and temper of the three men, as much as any in the nation, must say, that abstract from Mr. Shield's part, for faithfulness, zeal, love, and constancy to the cause of God, we found him by many degrees preferable to the other two, although he was, as said above, stolen off his feet by his false brethren. And as for Mr. Thomas's pamphlet, as we judge him to be the author, so as the swatch is not pleasing, being round spun lining indeed, we shall suffer the author to make the best hand of it he can. And as for what bitterness he hath tithed against the poor remnant by words and deeds, in hindering them to get the gospel faithfully preached, we begin the principal man that instigated his brethren to write to the colleges abroad, that all doors of hope might be shut as to the poor remnant's bettering their condition. We say, it ill became him to have stood so cross in the way of their mercy, of the preached gospel, for it was to their purses he was beholden, for what advancements he attained unto when abroad. The declaration of a poor, wasted, misrepresented remnant of the suffering, anti-popish, anti-prelatic, anti-Erastian, anti-sectarian, true Presbyterian Church of Christ in Scotland, united together in a general correspondence, published at St. Juar. It will be no doubt reputed by many a work both superfluous and unreasonable at this time to publish anything of this nature. Superfluous in regard that our principles and practices are abundantly manifest to the world, particularly in our Informatory Vindication, the testimony against the toleration and the contendings and sufferings of many of our dear brethren in their adhering to the same. And unseasonable, by reason of our present circumstances, being this day as sheep scattered upon the mountains, without a shepherd to gather or lead us, no man taking care for our souls, but instead thereof, all or most part waiting for our halting, looking for and lying in wait to catch advantage against the cause, through the least misbehavior of any of those who own it, and would, we doubt not, be glad of anything whereby they might get the least shadow of ground to reproach. Now when we are as signets and wonders, and have far more to criticize upon our words and actions than to kithe any sympathy with the scope and design of what we intend by the same, upon these and the like considerations, it may be a question whether at this time it be our duty to appear in this manner. Seeing much of the beauty and luster of a testimony, yea, and much of its weight depends upon being both seasonably exhibited and by men of understanding that have knowledge of the times and what Israel ought to do, these and many other things relative to the same, and they have in some measure been pondered by us, so have not altogether wanted their own weight to deter us from anything of that nature in such a juncture. But yet upon the other hand, when we consider that ever since the Lord's outstretched arm brought redemption to this land from anti-Christian darkness, and in an eminent way made it his own, by bringing us under these sacred and inviolable bonds of holy covenants, as enemies to their covenanted work of reformation, have not been, neither at this day are wanting for their part in carrying on their malignant designs in opposition to and for destruction of the covenant and cause of God, and have been not a little helped thereto by the faintings and dastardly yieldings of unfaithful and declining ministers and professors of the same. So likewise the Lord hath glorified his name, and hath so far dignified this church, as to have the honor, to the honor of his name be it spoken, of having still a party in her, who, notwithstanding the hellish cruelty of open and avowed enemies, in their persecution on the one hand, and the base and treacherous dealings of backsliding ministers and professors, in their reproaches and misrepresentations of that poor party on the other,